Alright, I'm sure at this point everyone has seen that there's a new playable path coming in 3.0, and today I'd like to spend a bit of time discussing that and also what it could mean for the future of the game. To start, I just want to say that I'm actually super excited that a new path is being added, not just because of the new game mechanics it will undoubtedly bring, but also because it shows that Hoyo is actually committed to adding new and interesting ways to play the game. Similar to how Dendro and Genshin completely changed that game because of the new mechanics it introduced, HSR can create entirely new metas built around whatever the new mechanics of each path are. But unlike Genshin, HSR has the more unique opportunity to keep adding more paths even after the Remembrance meta is over. Like, Genshin is currently limited to the 7 main elements by design, and I guess technically they could eventually add like a light and dark element like we see with Dainsleif and the twins, but HSR on the other hand has a whole bunch of other paths and aeons to pull from to keep adding more things into the game. I'd also like to think that getting a new path as we go into 3.0 shows Hoyo's willingness to add in even more paths in the future. I mentioned a few videos ago in my Nihility video that creating a new path is something I could see them doing to add diversity and also specialization to different roles. For example, they could split Nihility away from just generically encompassing debuffs into 2 paths where one is meant for debuffs and the other is meant for dot. That's just one example, but it would give them plenty of opportunities to add in specializations to other roles as well, or just keep adding new things altogether. That said, I do have some slight concerns, so I figured I'd make a video discussing my general thoughts on all this, both the good and the bad. Let's start with what's exciting to me by focusing just on Remembrance and the summon focus it seems to have for now. In my opinion, summons are probably one of the most interesting things they could have added because it's basically completely breaking the mold on what we're accustomed to in terms of gameplay. Like at a base level, getting an extra teammate will add in an entirely new layer of depth to the flow of combat, and assuming that you can have more than one summon, I can see it getting a bit crazy, which in my opinion is a good thing. Even if they limited it to just one summon per team or something like that, it's still a 5th unit added onto every team, even though so far we've only had at most 4. I can see this kind of gameplay change introducing a bunch of potential pros and cons. Frankly, we just don't know enough at this point, so everything that could happen is a possibility worth discussing, and that's what gets me really excited and invested in what's coming in 3.0. So let's talk about it. For one, I feel it definitely brings up some questions. Like, we know that summons can get shielded from what they show on the live stream, so that also means they most likely have individual health bars. So does that mean we now have to keep the summon alive? Maybe it means the summon shares HP with the character that summons it. What happens if your summon dies in MOC? Do you lose your 3 stars because a teammate technically died? Or maybe that doesn't matter. If we do have to keep them alive, how are they positioned? And how does that positioning play into things like getting healed by someone like Woho who has blast healing? Alongside that, there's SP to consider, or in other words, do the summons factor into SP economy? Can they gain SP? Do they use SP? If they can, does it mean that every summon on the field actually has a skill and a basic just like characters do? How will that affect characters like Sparkle, Sunday, Bronya, and Hanya who have SP generation as part of their kit, light cones, or eidolons? And all that is before considering what abilities the summons actually have and how they'll work. Are they going to be dealing damage? Are they going to be getting support abilities like giving a damage boost or an action advance? Do their abilities replace character abilities that summon them, or maybe they're separate? Like, all of this is super cool to think about because, like I said, we just don't know anything. There's like 10,000 different ways that summons could be added and their mechanics could be introduced into the game, and thinking about all those possibilities has me insanely excited for what will be coming in 3.0. I do want to say I guess we're going into this not completely blind because we do have a small frame of reference as to how it could play out, and that's the trash can event from a few patches ago. In that event, we had our summons essentially attached to our characters. While they did get to do basic attacks, they were pretty bare bones otherwise, and they basically triggered their super powerful move after you as a player did something specific with your characters. In that event, the trash cans essentially felt like a follow-up character summon, like Numbi for Topaz or Lightning Lord for Jingwan. It essentially made any character that you use into a follow-up unit similar to those two because anyone could trigger the effect, which was pretty neat, at least in my opinion. If it were added that way, honestly, I think it'd be pretty easy for them to expand on it further, and they could do this by simply just creating more unique effects than just a powerful attack after you hit whatever that trigger is. Like, here's a random example off the top of my head. Imagine a character like Seela, but with a summon. Instead of her talent proccing her resurgence ability off of a kill, a summon could do it after something happens during the fight. Stuff like that could be an easy way to add some extra flavor to characters' kits, and would also be a pretty interesting way to add longevity to the base units, because unlike the normal version of Seela who's basically feast or famine depending on whether she gets a kill or not, the Seela with a summon version would basically be always feasting as long as a trigger for her summon is more attainable than a kill is. All of these are just questions and thoughts that popped in my head while writing the script, but there's a whole bunch more that I could think of. It's an unknowable domain at this point, and honestly that's pretty exciting. Thinking of how the game can change and develop with stuff like this is all super interesting to me, because as I always say, what I really want in this game is variety in how different battles play out, and I could see a ton of ways that it can and probably will change going forward. All this said, while these questions and different possibilities are super exciting, I do have to say I also have some concerns as to how it could play out. A lot of those questions I ask can also be considered concerns. For example, if summons count as an additional team member that we have to keep alive, it'll make certain sustain units worse than they currently are and others super strong, potentially even more so than they currently are. Like, let's take Bailu for example. Her skill's heal bounces. If there's another unit for that heal to potentially target, there's even less of a chance that the unit you actually want to heal gets the healing. Another example is Fu Zhuan. If her matrix affects them and a boss does a huge AoE attack, that's even more damage that she has to mitigate across the team. On the other hand, units like Adventurine and also technically Gepard that give full team-wide shields get a huge boost, Adventurine particularly, as his follow-up counter shield will get even more stacks than it does currently. That said, I guess it does technically make it harder for them to fulfill their roles as taunters because there's yet another unit on the field that could potentially take the aggro. The other thing to consider is the summon abilities and the potential consequences of that. To frame out why this is slightly concerning, in my head, if summons have skills on top of the actual character having their skills and stuff like that, then that results in a lot of potential for power creep, or honestly even power downscaling depending on how they do it. Here's a hypothetical example. Imagine if there's a character that is a damage dealing unit that also has a support summon. On one hand, this could result in a super strong unit that's self-buffed by their summon, which essentially adds in an extra layer of damage bonuses on top of whatever else you have in your team. As a result, that might mean that the enemies have to compensate for that increased damage potential with even more HP inflation than we currently have. On the other hand, if they're properly balanced to where the summon takes away some of the power budget from the actual unit, that could result in there being an effective downscaling in unit power because you'd potentially have to spend extra SP for damage equivalent to other units. At that point, I feel it'd be pretty rough considering to actually roll for a unit like that, because if they have an effective cost of double the SP to get similar value to non-remembrance units, then their pull value kinda gets tossed out the window. Maybe that's why Sunday's kit works the way it does to compensate by heavily buffing both the unit and summon, while also being SP neutral at E0 and SP positive if you get his S1. A third hand, if you will, would be when you have a support unit mixed with a support summon. You'd be able to have one unit do something like action advancing with damage bonus, while their summon potentially gives something like break efficiency. It kinda leans towards the power creep issue if that doesn't get balanced around a power budget. Some other things to consider that are more metagame rather than being something specific like characters and their summons is how new paths will influence future game design. There's two predominant issues I see with new paths as a concept, and they're as follows. For one, I think if they keep adding new paths, it could result in a bloat of choices when characters are designed. As a hypothetical example, if we get an Enigmata path added on top of the new Remembrance Path, that's less opportunity for units of other neglected paths to actually get new units. While yes, these new paths could be used to buff up those old paths, like for example splitting Nihility like I mentioned earlier, it would most likely result in those neglected paths getting even less units than they did before. The other issue I could see is them using these new paths as a way to sell mechanics. Like, imagine if Super Break was an entirely new path rather than an add-on to pre-existing units. Not only would you have to get the new units, you'd also have to chase after their new Super Break Path light cones to actually work with them rather than being able to use the light cones you already have, for example the Herder Store cone that is usable by Firefly. That could result in a lot of pressure being put on the player to chase after the new mechanic because the game would definitely be catered around whatever that is. I can already see that potentially being a problem with the Remembrance Path and Summons, since unless they give us some free light cones, or maybe there's a new Herder Store light cone right when the patch drops or something like that, then we're gonna have to gacha for those new light cones. On the player's end, that would kinda end up super unfriendly as it would force us to spend Jades chasing after the hot new things just to stay relevant in an essentially forced meta, despite playing a game heavily focused on characters and how they interact with each other. Like, there wouldn't be another Himiko Super Break, because if it's an entirely new path mechanic rather than an add-on to something that characters already benefit from in the game, all of our old characters could potentially lose a lot of value. Hopefully it doesn't come to that though, and I do have to say, I am definitely going into this 3.x cycle a lot more optimistic than I think I have been in a long time with this game. I just wanted to get my thoughts out there and see what other people have to think about the meta moving forward. So on that note, what are your thoughts on new paths being added? Are you excited, or maybe you're going in with a little bit of caution? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Anyway, that's my rant. As always, thank you very much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.